All right, well, I will just get started while this is going around. So hello, everyone. My name is Matt Gough. I'm the Senior Campaign Representative of the Sierra Club working on building electrification. So I work specifically with cities and counties across the state that are considering REACH codes. So I'm going to spend some time today and talk about what REACH codes are, what a city considers when they're looking at REACH codes, how experts can play an important role in the process of adopting REACH codes, and then what the next steps are and what the landscape in California looks like. So just for some background context, Sierra Club, for folks who are not familiar, we are an environmental advocacy organization. Our claim to fame is that we are the oldest and largest environmental nonprofit in the US. So we've got like 3.5 million members and supporters across the country, chapters in every state. And here in California, we have 13 chapters and hundreds of thousands of members. So just some background for folks who might not have been familiar. So we'll just kick things off with what are REACH codes? So REACH codes at their core are local ordinances that city governments can pass. They supersede the state building code, so that's Title 24, Part 6. So Berkeley's ban on gas resembled a REACH code in a lot of ways in its final outcome, right? Like you have no gas in new construction, but it's not actually a REACH code in the official sense because it doesn't go through Title 24, Part 6. It goes through Berkeley's policing powers and public safety powers. So REACH codes generally apply to new buildings, though you could word a REACH code to apply to additions or add-ons, as well as major retrofits or renovations. The scope of REACH codes is also something that's like fairly variable. You could have single family, multifamily, commercial, or a combination of those things. They also could be building wide, or they could apply to specific appliances. So for example, in Carlsbad, California, they passed a REACH code that says that all new construction has to have heat pump water heaters, but they don't have to have heat pump space heaters. So it can be tweaked based on the city's interest. REACH codes are also zero emission focused. So it incentivizes all electric appliances and buildings. In a REACH code, the cost-effective pathway is all electric and the lowest emission option is all electric. So with a REACH code, you can have a gas or a mixed fuel building pathway, but that pathway is going to be less cost effective than an all electric pathway. And so it's going to incentivize builders to move all electric. So it's not a mandate, but it is sort of hurting folks in the direction of decarbonization. So Chris got into this, so I'll just kind of touch briefly on it. The legal requirements for REACH codes, so they need to be cost effective. So there need to be cost effectiveness studies that demonstrate that the proposed code pays for itself over the life of the building. And there needs to be at least one compliance pathway that is cost effective. They also can't be non-preempted. So you can't require appliances that exceed the federal minimum appliance efficiency standard. So like you couldn't have a REACH code that said that your heat pumps have to have an efficiency of 500% because the federal standard is like 240%, I believe. And then the final legal requirement at a high level is that buildings use no more energy than the state code. So pretty straightforward there. So there are a couple of different types of REACH codes. So this chart is folks came up with at the Building Decarbonization Coalition. The version of REACH codes at the Sierra Club and I think environmental advocacy organizations broadly are supportive are in the run category. So they have a preference for all electric construction. So there are no additional energy efficiency requirements in the run scenario. So whatever Title 24 is what builders have to meet, but it doesn't go beyond that for all electric appliances. If you have a mixed fuel project though, that does need to comply with Cal Green Tier 1, which is in Title 24 and has additional energy efficiency requirements. So in a mixed fuel building, in the run REACH code scenario, you've got an energy savings of 20 to 40% on mixed fuel buildings. It's going to make that more expensive. So again, you're pushing developers and builders towards the all-electric pathway. And if folks really have a burning desire for a mixed fuel building, they can still do that, but it's going to be putting less greenhouse gas emissions into the air. And that was a pun. So the walk version is similar to the run. So it doesn't have any additional efficiency requirements for all electric buildings or appliances, but there are additional efficiency requirements for mixed fuel buildings, and you can get there through a combination of energy efficiency, expanded solar generation, and energy storage systems. So here we have a like adoption process / like potential timeline. So this is currently geared for 2019, but this is something that could be applied to any city that was looking at potentially adopting a REACH code. In my mind, this first bullet point is like the information gathering phase. So at this point, you're looking at a city that is looking at having staff reports, draft resolutions in support of a REACH code. Cities are going to be looking for cost effectiveness studies. Some of these cost effectiveness studies already exist out in the world, but sometimes city staff want to go and create their own for their specific locality. There's model code language. So again, this already exists and is floating around. So cities could take from what has already been created or could draft their own depending on what their needs are. This is when folks are going to have a lot of questions. This is a great point in phase 1 for technical presentation. So I'm going to get into shortly the need for experts in the room to help this process move forward. And having builders and developers and architects who can speak to the feasibility and the cost effectiveness of all electric construction really goes a long way when a city is thinking about what makes sense for them. Public input is also important at the information gathering phase. So oftentimes the decision makers for REACH codes are elected officials, and elected officials are elected. They want to do what the people who put them in office want them to do. And so the more that we can do to show that the public backs REACH codes and is excited about it, the more likely it is that we get a speedy and aggressive adoption process. All right, so we've got compliance and stakeholder engagement, sort of due diligence for making sure that you're ready to move forward on a REACH code. Phase 2 is decision making. So the city council is actually voting on the REACH codes at the decision making phase. You're sending it to the CEC for review. My understanding right now is that the CEC has a review window of like 60 to 90 days for REACH codes after they've been passed by a city council, but that starting January 1, 2020, they're going to shrink that window to 15 days. So we're seeing signaling from the state level that this is something that they want to support and that they want to have happen more quickly. So it's exciting. And then the final piece is implementation, right? So like actually getting REACH codes to become the law of the land. And throughout this process, you need stakeholder engagement. So engaging the building communities, the business communities, like everybody who's going to be touched by this should be aware of the impacts on the REACH code, and the city will serve itself by getting a lot of voices in the room early on. Okay, so support and coverage. So there are a bunch of people and organizations who are working on REACH codes across the state. This is a list of some agencies and CCEs and CCAs that are supporting REACH codes. There's also groups like the NRDC, the Building Decarbonization Coalition, Earth Justice, like a whole host of folks who are working on this. The progress that we've seen so far in Berkeley and in some of the other cities that have adopted REACH codes in the past and are looking at doing so later this year or next year is definitely a collective effort. So just like a shout out to everybody who's been working on this from like the policy and advocacy side of things. Like we're at the tipping point and a bunch of dominoes are about to fall. So really exciting stuff. So next up, we have a city's consideration. So these are just like some of the top line issues that we have identified that cities are going to care about. So affordability and timeliness is a huge one. California is in housing crisis, right? Like we've got close to 40 million people who live here now. We're on track to have 50 million people living here in the not too distant future. And city councils, as progressive as they may be, are also concerned about their ability to house all of the people who want to live in their city. And so the more that we can do to show that all electric construction reduces costs and reduces the amount of time it takes to construct, the more that we will be doing to serve ourselves and to get folks really excited about this. The good news is that there are a bunch of studies that already support that. The statewide code and utilities team put out a study that said in, I believe it's single family residential, you're saving $5,000 in construction costs. And in multifamily construction, you're saving $2,000 per unit. So there are big savings, and making sure that people understand that is super important. Another city consideration is like climate resiliency and climate change. So some cities, think climate change is like a bad thing and would be excited to like pass policies that address that. That's great. There are other cities that maybe are not so forward-looking, but are concerned about like climate resiliency, right? Like California is a state that is prone to earthquakes, we're prone to wildfires and other natural disasters. Gas lines are things that can rupture, the things that can catch fire, and things that can explode. Actually, as Sean noted yesterday, there's like one gas incident every day in our state, like one person getting injured or maimed by gas.
One explosion in the country per year, per day.
Oh, okay.
For the last 10 years, there's been an explosion a day in our country.
Gotcha.
In the state of California, it's less, but fun.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like there was explosion today, right? Like that's wild. Like that's not something that we should have, coursing through our national infrastructure. So the other thing that we know is that climate events are going to get worse and more frequent as climate change continues to get worse. And so as cities think about preparing themselves for this new future, all electric construction is a way to mitigate some of that damage. And that argument is going to resonate with some people. Regulatory headwinds. So, California has some landmark legislation that says that we need to be carbon-free by 2045. We're seeing from the CEC that they are on board with electrification. The study that Pierre mentioned that E3 put out showing that gas is going to become dramatically more expensive in the near future. These are all things that cities, if they're paying attention, will recognize as potential problems and things that they can get ahead of by passing REACH codes. So making sure that cities are aware of that is important. Public health is another big one. So there have been studies done that show that in a majority of homes that have gas stoves, when those gas stoves are on, the indoor air quality would be illegal if found outdoors. Like that's pretty shocking. They've also found that homes with gas stoves have higher instances of childhood asthma. So that's another thing that nobody wants, right? It's an argument that really resonates with city elected officials. There's precedent. So this can go both ways. You have cities like Berkeley that really want to be like leader cities and get out and sort of change what the national conversation is. And so appealing to decision makers with that argument can go a long way for people like who just kind of want to go out on the limb and be off on their own for a period of time. On the other end, there's cities who are afraid of precedent. And so having cities like Berkeley is great because you can point to them and say, Berkeley has done this, they're getting support from the CEC, they're getting support from the state more broadly, like you have the cover that you need to pass this REACH code in a way that isn't gonna leave you high and dry. And then finally, it's community and business support. So I touched on this briefly earlier. Decision makers are elected, and ultimately what the community says is going to impact their decisions. So if you have supporters packing city council meetings in support of a REACH code, it's very likely it's going to be passed, especially because REACH codes are cost effective. On the opposite side of things, if you have opposition passing the room, that's going to be a big problem. So opposition, who is it? The gas industry is the opposition, right? It's like these are folks who make their living from selling gas, and obviously they don't want it to go away. So SoCal Gas is, I think, the sort of biggest culprit in California. They're owned by Sempra. They serve like 22 million people across the state, which is pretty crazy. They are nefarious in a lot of different ways. There's sort of a very organized and coordinated misinformation campaign that is out there, like spreading facts about electrification that is wrong and spreading lies about gas that aren't true as well. So that's not great. On top of that, like SoCal Gas is like fairly sophisticated. They started a group called Citizens for like Balanced Energy Solutions, which is like masquerading as a community group that actually was paid for by SoCal Gas, and they are trying to get cities in Southern California to pass resolutions that would require a city to get their energy from like mixed sources, right? Like basically stopping the ability of a city to electrify, which is like terrifying. We didn't see that in Berkeley, which was great, but Berkeley isn't Southern California, which is the heart of the gas industry. And so when we're doing this work in places where the gas industry is strong, that is a big consideration and a big sort of challenge that needs to be accounted for. Otherwise, you'll be shooting yourself in the foot. Another like big challenge is like a lack of awareness. Your average person doesn't know what building electrification means, right? Like if you talk to your parents, your kids, whoever, it's like you say building electrification or building decarbonization, it's just like the eyes glaze over and there's not like a real understanding. And that's a problem. People just aren't aware that California emits like almost a quarter of its greenhouse gases from buildings. People aren't aware of the health impacts of stoves. In fact, like people love their gas-fired stove. Like they think that they are great and have a visceral negative reaction if you tell them that they should get rid of their gas stove. So that's a challenge. It's the same thing for elected officials. They're people too. They have the same sort of understanding as your average person. So the more that we can do to educate them, it's important. And then industry's awareness of electrification is also a potential challenge, right? Like if a developer has never built an all-electric project before, they might be hesitant to take that on. And so the more that we can do to demonstrate that this is a viable thing that is already happening in a lot of places, the better off we'll be. So how industry experts can make an impact. So how all of you can help this process along. So, I mean, there are like a ton of ways. These are only some suggestions. These are photos from the Berkeley City Council meeting where they talked about their gas ban. Letters of support are great. Letters of support can be used in like lobby meetings. You can say like, hey, I've got this letter here from like X engineer or Y architect, and they support this for whatever reason. That goes a long way in conveying credibility, right? Like I work with the Sierra Club, and so when I meet with an elected official and talk about this issue, I get credit for the environmental angle, but as soon as we're talking about the feasibility of a building, like my ability to like project real like confidence is undermined. And so having those letters that show that architects and engineers, developers, builders are on board really goes a long way in convincing the people who need to be convinced. Public statements are in that same vein. So actually showing up to meetings and talking on behalf of sort of your expertise is great. Technical advising is awesome. I think that in the Berkeley example, Scott Shell did some like advising or presenting to the Berkeley City Council that helped. And then actually meeting with your elected officials in person as an expert. So this is just a picture of Berkeley. This is fun. We had a bunch of people in the room. We ended up getting a unanimous vote there, which was awesome. And yeah, so next steps. So there are a bunch of cities across the state that are potentially looking at adopting REACH codes. There are over 50 cities who have indicated that they are interested in REACH codes. Now that interest is on a spectrum, right? On one end of the spectrum, it's like a city like logged onto a call to learn what a REACH code is. And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got cities who actually have REACH codes in the works that are gonna be passed by the end of this year. But still, 50 cities is a lot. And there are some that are closer than others. So San Jose and Menlo Park are both looking at passing pretty aggressive REACH codes this year. Actually, the city of Oakland and Alameda have reached out after Berkeley passed their gas ban and are looking at doing a similar gas ban themselves, which even goes beyond a REACH code, which is great. We heard that San Francisco is looking at doing a gas ban in their municipal buildings, which is huge. Santa Monica is looking at reach codes. San Luis Obispo is looking at reach codes. There's a whole bunch of cities who are going to do this by the end of this year or early next year, which is great. So there are ways for all of y'all to engage in this process. One is to keep an eye on the California Building Decarb listserv. There are often calls for support and engagement. So if somebody says we need people to show up to this meeting, or we need like a technical letter in support of Y project, you should do that. Like, your voice matters and it makes an impact, and we need you to engage in these processes. You can reach out to me directly if you want like a Sierra Club tint to things. We've got chapters all across the state and all across the country, and I can connect you with some of our local leaders if you want to get involved in that route. We're actually working with Sean to create like a technical endorsement document. So the vision here is that it would be like a 1 to 2, maybe 3-page document that explains like building electrification in terms that a layperson could understand. And then we're going to have a bunch of architects and builders and engineers sign on to the letter, so that when we're doing lobby meetings, it's not just the Sierra Club who's showing up, it's the whole building electrification community to convey that credibility and authority on the issue. So you can sign on to that. And you can lobby your own city council members. So like, show up to whatever city you live in, ask for a meeting with your council people, and talk to them about why this matters. Like, we live in a huge country, and like politics can oftentimes seem like removed or alien, but you would be like surprised how accessible local politics is. So I would encourage you to get involved in your community, see what's going on, and help to push it in the right direction. So that is what I've got.